All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're jumping into the world of AI again today. And, well, things are moving so fast, you really have to stay on top of it to know what's going on.
It can feel like every day there's a new headline.
Exactly. So, we're going to do a deep dive today on a company that's been making some serious noise in the AI space, Deepseek.
Yep, seek. And, I think for our listeners especially, what we really need to figure out is it safe to use this thing? I mean, that's the big
Yeah.
question, right?
Yeah.
Safe to use. That's what our sources are really pointing to, at least,
Hmm.
especially given that it's a Chinese company. And for finance, I mean, that's where things get particularly interesting or tricky, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, and the implications for investors, that's something we've got to unpack carefully. So that's what this deep dive is for, taking a look at the risks involved and whether it's worth it.
Yeah, strategic risk assessment. You got it.
Exactly. So maybe let's back up just a little bit for anyone who's not totally familiar with DeepSeek. What are we talking about here? Who are these guys?
So DeepSeek, they're an AI research lab, and they're based in China.
Okay, China. So right away, that's a big factor to consider. We'll definitely come back to that.
Yeah, we'll unpack that for sure. But first, let's talk about what they do. They're really known for their coding models and language models. Actually, you often see their name mentioned right alongside the big players like OpenAI and Anthropic.
Okay, so in the same league as some pretty heavy hitters. That says something right there.
Yeah. I mean, they've got some serious tech,
Mm.
and they've got an API that developers can use, but they've also released apps like a chatbot that anyone can use.
Oh, interesting. So they're making it accessible to the everyday user as well, not just developers.
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely a company to watch. But as we said, there are these really important security and privacy questions that come into play, especially given their location and the different legal and geopolitical landscapes involved.
Right. And for our listeners in finance who are dealing with sensitive data day in and day out, that's a huge consideration.
Absolutely. And that's what this deep dive is all about, giving you the information you need to make informed decisions.
Okay, so let's dive into those risks. What exactly are we talking about here when we say DeepSeek's Chinese origin raises concerns beyond just, it being China? What are the specific factors we need to understand?
Okay, so as we've said, DeepSeek is a Chinese company headquartered in China. And one thing that's important to know is that they're believed to be backed by private investment, potentially, from what we understand, a Chinese hedge fund. So that adds a whole other layer to think about, especially for investors.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so there's a financial web there that could be significant.
Absolutely. Now, when we talk about the technology itself, it's pretty advanced. I mean, they're really making waves, especially with their code generation capabilities. That's a huge deal in finance, for things like algorithmic trading. If you can automate some of that development and analysis, well, that's a big advantage.
Yeah, I can see how that would be super attractive in the financial world. Speed and efficiency are everything.
Right. And it's not just code. They're also strong in translation and complex reasoning. Think about it. An AI that can actually understand financial reports, even in different languages, and help you make sense of all the data to assess risk. That's powerful.
Yeah, that's next level stuff. And they're putting it right in people's hands with these apps. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, so they're definitely a force to be reckoned with. But, and this is a big but, we need to talk about safety. And that's where those concerns about their Chinese origin become really important.
Okay, safety. That's the crux of it. What makes DeepSeek different in terms of safety and security than other AI companies we might be more familiar with?
There are a couple of layers to this. First, you've got the general privacy and security risks that come with pretty much any AI. Like data collection, data storage, data usage, potential for leaks, all that stuff.
Right, the things we should be thinking about with any online service we use.
Exactly. But then you have the concerns that are specific to DeepSeek because it's a Chinese company. It's what our sources call the China factor. And that's where things get a bit more complicated.
Okay, the China factor. Lay it out for us. What are the specific concerns that arise because DeepSeek is based in China?
Right. So let's start with data collection. I mean, we need to look at their specific terms of service to get the full picture, but realistically, they're probably collecting things like the prompts you enter, the responses the AI generates, your IP address, device information, and, well, maybe account details if you create an account.
So, fairly standard stuff at first glance, but then you have to consider the kind of information someone in finance might be putting into this thing.
Exactly. Imagine a financial analyst using the chatbot. They might be tempted to input proprietary trading algorithms or sensitive client data, things they really shouldn't be sharing. But the ease of use might make them think, oh, that's just a chatbot, no big deal.
Right, and suddenly that highly sensitive data could be in DeepSeek's hands.
And where is that data most likely stored? Well, given that it's a Chinese company, most likely on servers in China.
Okay, so that brings us to the legal jurisdiction issue. Data in China is subject to Chinese law, and that's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about any law. We're talking about laws like the national security law, which can compel companies to hand over data to the government if they're asked. So for anyone outside of China using DeepSeek, particularly businesses dealing with sensitive financial data, that's a big red flag.
Yeah, it introduces a level of uncertainty and potential risk that's hard to ignore, especially in a field like finance where data security is so critical.
Absolutely. And it's not just the laws themselves, it's also about transparency. How open is DeepSeek about their data handling practices? What they collect, how they use it, all that.
Yeah.
The thing is, even with companies that have the best intentions, these privacy policies can be vague. And then when you add in a different regulatory environment like China's, well, getting a clear picture becomes even harder.
So basically, we're in a bit of a black box situation.
To a certain extent, yeah. And then there's a question of security measures. We can assume they have some in place, but verifying how strong those measures actually are, that's practically impossible from the outside. Remember, the AI industry in general has had its share of vulnerabilities exposed by cybersecurity researchers.
Mhm.
So no one is totally immune to risk.
Right, even the big names have had their hiccups. So it's not unreasonable to assume DeepSeek might have similar vulnerabilities, even if they haven't been publicly disclosed yet.
Right. And then on top of all of that, there's this whole other layer of concern about potential censorship and monitoring.
Oh, yeah, the sources mention that. It's kind of a subtle issue, but potentially significant. What's the deal with that?
Well, there have been some, anecdotal reports and experiments that suggest that Chinese AI chatbots might censor certain topics, things that are politically sensitive. For example, if you ask about Taiwan or the Tiananmen Square incident, you might get filtered responses, or the chatbot might just dodge the question altogether.
So it's like there's a built-in bias or at least a sensitivity to certain topics.
Yes. It seems that way. And while it might seem like just a content generation issue, it really points to the possibility of broader monitoring and filtering mechanisms at play, mechanisms that could be influenced by the government.
Okay, so that's a bit unsettling, especially if you're inputting sensitive information that you don't want potentially flagged or scrutinized.
Right. And I think all of this, the data collection, the storage in China, the legal jurisdiction, the lack of transparency, the potential for censorship, it all adds up to some pretty serious geopolitical risks. And those risks are especially important for decision makers in finance.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What are the specific implications for those in leadership roles, those who are making investment decisions when it comes to using DeepSeek?
Well, for anyone in that position, the geopolitical context is crucial. When you choose to use technology from a Chinese AI company, you're stepping into a complex web of international relations, regulations, and potential risks. One of the big ones is data sovereignty. The idea that information entered into DeepSeek could be accessed by the Chinese government, and that has implications for intellectual property, trade secrets, any confidential corporate or client data you might be handling.
Yeah, it's a whole different level of risk than, say, working with a US-based company.
Exactly. And for industries like finance, where you have so much sensitive data and strict regulatory requirements, that risk is magnified. Then you add in the fact that the legal and regulatory landscapes are very different. China has its data protection laws like the PIPL, but the government's ability to access data can sometimes override individual or corporate privacy expectations.
So you might think you have certain protections, but in reality, those protections might not be as strong as you think they are.
Right. And that's a big difference from, say, GDPR in Europe, which has much stricter rules around data privacy and government access.
So it's not just about where the data is stored, it's about the whole legal framework surrounding it.
Exactly. And then there's this other thing to consider, supply chain risk. If you become heavily reliant on a foreign AI provider, especially one based in a region with potential geopolitical tensions, you're introducing a vulnerability. What if access to the technology is suddenly restricted, or their policies change because of some international event?
Yeah, you're kind of at the mercy of forces beyond your control, and that's not a good position to be in, especially when it comes to critical business operations.
Right. And that contrasts with U.S. tech companies like OpenAI or Anthropic. They operate under a different set of rules, so there's a different level of perceived stability.
Okay, so we've talked about the risks, but what about the alternatives? How does DeepSeek stack up against more commonly used options like ChatGPT or Claude?
Yeah, that's a great question. So OpenAI and Anthropic, they're the OS companies. So right away, they're operating within a different legal framework. They still have their own security concerns and data privacy debates, but at least you're dealing with U.S. law and, for European users, GDPR. They also both offer enterprise solutions that tend to have better privacy protections built in. For example, they might promise not to use data from the API to train their models. But, and this is important, their free versions, the ones anyone can use, they still collect data.
Right, so there's still a trade-off there. You get the convenience, but you might be sacrificing some privacy.
Exactly. But the biggest difference between them and DeepSeek is jurisdiction. Who has the power to access your data? U.S. companies are subject to U.S. law, things like FISA Section 702, but DeepSeek, that data falls under Chinese law, and that's where the perception of risk really comes in. Someone in the U.S. might feel a lot more comfortable with a U.S. company because they understand the rules of the game.
Yeah, it's all about your threat model, where you see the biggest potential for trouble.
Right. And I think for someone in finance, especially someone in a decision-making role, that threat model needs to be very carefully considered.
Absolutely. So let's get specific about that. For our listeners in finance, what are the potential benefits and, more importantly, the risks they need to be weighing when it comes to DeepSeek?
Well, the potential benefits are definitely there. Those advanced AI capabilities we talked about, especially in coding. That could be a game changer for developing algorithms or automating analysis. And access to new AI tools can also lead to innovation. Plus, depending on their pricing, DeepSeek might seem like a more budget-friendly option at first.
So there are some tempting advantages, but I think we've made it pretty clear that the risks are significant, especially in finance.
Yeah, the risks are huge. I mean, you've got the data security and privacy concerns, the potential for state access, the jurisdictional issues. Then there's the intellectual property risk. What if your proprietary models or trading strategies get exposed? And then compliance with things like GDPR. That becomes a big headache if you're dealing with data from EU citizens. And finally, there's the reputational damage to consider. If you're using AI tools that are seen as insecure or linked to surveillance, that could really hurt your brand and client trust.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider. And I think it's safe to say that for most financial institutions, especially those in Western countries with stricter regulations, the risks probably outweigh the benefits.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when dealing with sensitive data. But let's say our listener is still curious about DeepSeek. Maybe they want to explore its capabilities for non-sensitive tasks. What steps can they take to at least try to mitigate some of these inherent risks?
Yeah, what's the safest way to approach this if you're determined to use DeepSeek in some capacity?
Okay. First of all, assume no privacy for sensitive data. Anyone confidential, client data, anything like that, don't put it into DeepSeek, at least not the public version. If they have an enterprise version with strong privacy guarantees, that might be a different story. But for the regular version, just assume it's not private.
So basically, treat it like you're shouting it from the rooftops.
Pretty much. Next, read their terms of service and privacy policies. But don't just skim them. Really dig in and try to understand what they're actually saying. And remember, they're operating under Chinese law, so what they say might not align with the legal realities.
Right, it's the context that matters. The words on the page might not tell the whole story.
Exactly. And keep in mind, those policies can change. So you need to stay informed. Keep an eye on any news about DeepSeek, any security breaches they might have, any changes in the geopolitical landscape, because all of that can impact how safe it is to use.
So it's not a set it and forget it situation. You
Yeah.
have to be vigilant.
Right. And if you're going to use it, limit it to things that aren't sensitive. Public information, open source code, things like that. And if you're in an organization, set clear rules about what's acceptable and what's not.
So basically, treat it with extreme caution.
Yeah, I'd say so. If you're really curious about the technology, you could experiment in a sandbox environment, a closed system that's not connected to your main network. And if you're dealing with sensitive data, stick to providers that offer strong privacy and security. Companies like OpenAI, Microsoft Azure, Anthropic, they all have enterprise solutions that might be a better fit.
Okay, so lots of things to consider, but ultimately the question remains, is DeepSeek safe to use? Especially for someone making decisions in the financial world, what's the bottom line?
I think for high-level decision makers, investors, anyone handling sensitive financial data, the answer is be very, very careful. The potential benefits are there, but the risks are significant. You've got to weigh them carefully. And in most cases, especially for Western organizations that have to comply with strict regulations, those risks are probably going to outweigh the benefits.
So not a blanket no, but definitely proceed with extreme caution and maybe a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly. I mean, if you're just using it for something basic, maybe it's okay. But if you're dealing with anything sensitive, anything that could impact your business, your clients, your reputation, think twice. Really think twice, because the consequences could be huge.
It's a reminder that AI is powerful, but it's not a magic solution. And sometimes the most innovative tech comes with the biggest risks.
And, it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of all this new technology. But you can't forget the bigger picture. You have to think about the legal framework, the geopolitical situation, the potential long-term impacts. It's not just about the tech itself. It's about the whole ecosystem surrounding it.
And as our source material suggests, it's time to start thinking about next steps. What's the takeaway message you want to leave our listener with today?
I think the key is due diligence. Do your research. Understand the risks. And don't be afraid to ask hard questions. Because at the end of the day, the decisions you make about AI could have a huge impact on your business, your career, even your personal life. So choose wisely.
Great advice. And for our listeners, keep diving deep. The world of AI is complex, but it's also incredibly fascinating. Stay informed, stay curious, and stay safe.